A stadium in Ohio is reportedly filling up like it's hosting a national holiday, and almost nobody watching from home can explain why. Why would a city with, according to local estimates, barely 2,000 Filipino residents produce crowds that look like 250,000 people showed up? Why are veteran tennis reporters, the ones who have covered this sport for decades and seen every kind of manufactured hype come and go, the ones who are supposed to be impossible to surprise, suddenly the most visibly stunned people in the building? Why does the tournament's 17th seed, a player who reportedly does not currently hold a winning record against either of her possible second-round opponents, already have fans camping outside a practice court before she has hit a single competitive ball? And why does one of the most respected doubles legends in the sport keep circling back to her name in interviews, almost like she's watching something she still can't fully explain? Something unusual is allegedly unfolding right now in Mason, Ohio, and by the time this video ends, you will understand exactly why the numbers don't add up on paper, and exactly why that's the entire point of this story. Let's start with the math, because the math is what breaks this wide open. Toronto is reportedly home to over 270,000 Filipino residents, one of the largest Filipino communities anywhere outside the Philippines itself. So when Alex competed there weeks earlier, nobody questioned why the arena felt like a home match. That part of the story lined up perfectly with everything sports fandom is supposed to look like. Massive local population, generations of families who show up every year, decades of built-in community infrastructure behind the scenes. Cincinnati has none of that. According to available population data, the Filipino community here sits somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people. Do that math slowly, because it matters. Toronto's community was roughly 250 times larger, and yet according to people physically present in both cities, the atmosphere feels nearly identical. That is not a small gap. That is a statistical impossibility in a sport where crowd size has always tracked directly with population size, which is exactly why long-time insiders reportedly cannot make sense of it. They know what predictable fandom looks like. They know what community-driven support is supposed to look like on paper, and whatever this is, it does not fit that pattern at all. So rewind with me for a second, because to understand how Cincinnati got here, you have to understand the sequence of moments that allegedly built toward this exact morning, and it does not start in Ohio at all. It starts with a debut nobody was watching closely enough. This is technically Alex's first time ever competing at the Cincinnati event. She was originally scheduled to play it the year before, but a shoulder injury reportedly forced her to withdraw before she ever stepped on the court. So underneath everything else happening this week, there is a quiet personal milestone buried in plain sight. A first-time appearance arriving directly on the back of what may be the single best stretch of her career, and also on the back of one of the most physically demanding runs she has ever had to survive. Because before Cincinnati, there was Toronto. And before Toronto, there was a comeback that by any normal measure should not have happened at all. Alex reportedly won her very first WTA Tour title in Washington, the 600th, at an event most casual fans would never have circled on a calendar in advance. It was not supposed to be her moment. And yet somewhere inside that tournament, something shifted. A dramatic from-behind title run that ended with her in tears during a post-match interview after defeating a former Wimbledon champion. A moment so raw, according to those who saw it unfold live, that it stopped functioning like a simple tennis highlight and instead became something people who don't even follow the sport started sharing on their own. That is the first domino. Then came Toronto, and this is where the story stops looking like a rising player enjoying a hot month and starts looking like the early edge of something much larger. She reportedly advanced to the 4th round of the National Bank Open, and the crowd behavior there was allegedly so intense that Alex herself later described the experience online as feeling like being inside a barangay, using the Filipino word for neighborhood, comparing the noise and chaos inside a 12,500-seat arena to the electric, packed atmosphere of a community basketball league final back home. Sit with that comparison for a second, because it matters. She was not describing a polite tennis crowd clapping respectfully between points. She was describing something closer to a hometown celebration, allegedly transplanted thousands of miles from where she actually grew up. And here is the detail that should genuinely stop you. Even her opponents reportedly noticed it out loud after defeating her in that Toronto match. A former world number 4 turned to the stands afterward and publicly acknowledged, in her own words, that most of the crowd had clearly been supporting Alex, thanking them anyway for how electric the atmosphere had felt. Think about that for a moment. A player who had just won her match still reportedly felt compelled to acknowledge out loud that the crowd belonged to the woman she had just defeated. That is not standard tournament energy. That is something closer to gravitational pull, strong enough to bend an entire arena, even in a loss, which is exactly why Cincinnati should have been the quiet chapter, the reset, the tournament where none of that emotional intensity should have followed her, because the local population simply does not exist to sustain it. And yet, according to everyone on the ground this week, it followed her anyway, which brings us to Rennae Stubbs, a name that carries genuine weight inside this sport. Someone who has reportedly watched decades of players rise and fall, who has seen manufactured hype collapse under its own weight more times than she can count. And when Stubbs talks about Alex, she does not talk about her like a temporary story. She has reportedly framed Cincinnati as the next real test, a chance to prove that Washington and Toronto were not a lucky, unrepeatable streak, but the start of something genuinely sustainable. And then she says, the part that should really make you pause, that regardless of how far Alex advances in this specific tournament, more people are already talking about her than ever before, and that people inside the sport genuinely believe she has the potential to pull an entirely new generation of fans into tennis. That is not a small statement. That is not the kind of casual praise handed out to every promising young player. That is someone with decades of built-up credibility, looking at a still unfolding story and publicly staking her reputation on the idea that this is bigger than one hot month. But here is where the story takes a sharper, more uncomfortable turn, because all of this adoration, all of this crowd energy building around her, is reportedly arriving directly ahead of a match that could end her tournament before it has really even started. Alex enters as the 17th seed, which earns her a bye straight into the second round. Waiting there is one of two players, Poland's Magda Linette or Romania's Elena-Gabriela Ruse. And here is the part nobody camping outside that practice court wants to think about too hard. She reportedly does not currently hold a winning record against either one of them. Start with the tougher of the two possible outcomes. If Ruse is waiting across the net, the history is genuinely brutal. Alex is reportedly winless against her, having lost in 3 tight, punishing sets back during the 2024 US Open qualifiers, and Ruse is dangerous right now, in this exact stretch, having reportedly just pulled off a jaw-dropping comeback in Toronto, only days earlier, clawing back from trailing 4 games to love in a set to beat an American opponent in 3 sets. That is not a player limping into Cincinnati worn down. That is a player who just proved, in the very city Alex left behind, that she thrives specifically in moments where a match looks already finished. Now consider the other possibility. If it is Linette instead, the picture looks slightly friendlier on the surface. The two have reportedly split their 4 career meetings evenly, and Alex has actually won the last 2 at the ASB Classic and again at the Miami Open. That sounds like real momentum until you look further back. Linette reportedly beat her twice before that stretch, once in Abu Dhabi in 2024 and again in Nottingham in 2025. And there is one more detail that should make anyone underestimating Linette think twice. This is reportedly the same player who just months earlier at the 2026 Miami Open defeated a 5-time Grand Slam champion. That is not a name anyone should dismiss as a routine second-round formality. That is a 34-year-old veteran who has already shown this year exactly what she is capable of when the moment demands it. So here is the real tension sitting underneath every single person camping outside that practice court right now. They are not there because the outcome feels safe. They are there despite knowing, on paper, that this match could end in heartbreak, and that single fact changes everything about how this crowd should actually be read. This is not blind, guaranteed win fandom. This is people choosing to show up anyway, because somewhere along the way, watching her stopped being about the scoreline on a screen. and started being about something else entirely. There is also a physical toll buried underneath all of this that rarely gets mentioned. Nearly 2 straight weeks of high-level, high-pressure tennis reportedly led directly into her exit from the Canadian Open, and from there, barely any recovery time before landing in Ohio. Her team has reportedly been working overtime just to keep her body from breaking down completely, and she has been open about how much she currently values simply staying healthy, treating it, in her own words, like the single most important priority on her list right now. She is not walking into Cincinnati fresh, she is walking and running on fumes. And the fans lining up before sunrise appear to understand that completely, showing up anyway, treating every practice session like it carries the same weight as the match itself. Now here is where you need to understand where she actually came from, because it reframes everything you have just heard. This is reportedly a woman who trained growing up on courts with visible cracks running through the surface, gaps in the net, no fencing to stop a stray ball from rolling into the street, in a country widely known to have limited infrastructure for producing professional tennis players at all, let alone one capable of competing at this level. That is not a polished academy origin story. That is raw, and that kind of beginning, when it eventually breaks through, tends to create the most loyal, most emotionally invested fan bases in all of sports, because people are not simply watching a talented athlete succeed. They are watching someone climb out of almost nothing in real time, and they feel, in some way, like they are part of that climb. And when reporters have asked her directly about the crowds that have turned every recent North American stop into something resembling a home match, she reportedly keeps circling back to the same idea, that the support isn't really about her individually, that it belongs to something larger than her, and that it keeps growing right alongside her, city after city. That kind of framing matters more than people initially realize. A player who pushes the spotlight outward instead of hoarding it tends to build the kind of relationship with an audience that does not fade over time, the kind that multiplies instead of leveling off. So zoom all the way out for a moment, because here is the piece that should genuinely unsettle you if you sit with it for more than a few seconds. Tennis fandom has historically been built almost entirely on proximity. If a player draws a massive crowd in a foreign city, it is typically because that city already has a large population from the player's home country, decades of built infrastructure, local federations, selling tickets specifically to that community, generations of families who show up every single year simply because that is what their community has always done. Alex reportedly has none of that in Cincinnati. No decades of built infrastructure, no generational fan base, just a handful of months of results, one viral, tearful interview, one dramatic comeback title, one electric night in Toronto. And somehow, that alone has apparently been enough to generate a crowd that mirrors a city with 250 times the built-in population. That is not a fan base she inherited. That is one she appears to be actively building in real time, one tournament at a time, in front of everyone watching. And here's why that distinction matters so much. Community-driven support is powerful, but it is geographically limited by definition. It only shows up where the community already lives. Crossover fandom does not work that way. It follows the person, not the population. It shows up in cities with almost no built-in connection to her at all, purely because people have reportedly decided they are fans of her specifically. The same way audiences worldwide have historically become fans of certain superstar athletes with no personal tie to their home country whatsoever. And once a player crosses that particular line, the ceiling on how far this could travel basically disappears. Which brings us to the part of this story that could make everything you have just heard feel like a warm-up act. New York is next. The US Open is reportedly only weeks away, and New York is home to one of the largest, most passionate Filipino communities anywhere in the United States, a community that reportedly dwarfs what she experienced in Toronto, let alone the tiny population currently packing itself into Cincinnati this week. If a city with barely 2,000 Filipino residents is already producing scenes that stun tour veterans, imagine what happens when she walks onto a court in front of a community measured not in the thousands, but potentially in the hundreds of thousands. Cincinnati might not even be the peak of this story. It might just be the preview. Crowd energy is not simply emotional background noise. Players consistently describe how a supportive crowd can shift the actual rhythm of a tight match, how it can hand you an extra half second of belief on a break point, how it can carry you through an exhausted third set when your legs are reportedly screaming at you to stop. She has already shown this season, in that gutting comeback win over a top American opponent in Washington, that she has the reported ability to find her best tennis exactly when the moment demands it most. So when she eventually walks out against Ruse or Linette, whichever name ends up standing across the net, she will not simply be facing a dangerous opponent. She will be walking out with a stadium full of people who reportedly have no demographic reason to be there in these numbers, and who showed up anyway, fully aware of exactly how difficult this match could become. That is the real story, sitting quietly underneath the surprise. It was never really about Cincinnati, or Toronto before it, or Washington before that. It is about a woman who reportedly trained on cracked courts with no fencing, who cried on camera after defeating a Wimbledon champion, who turned one relentless summer into a wave that keeps rolling forward, no matter how small the local welcoming committee is technically supposed to be. Normally, this kind of crossover appeal takes years to build, sometimes an entire career. She has reportedly built the early version of it in a single summer. So whatever happens, once the draw is finalized, whoever ultimately walks onto that court to face her, remember this: the crowd is not there because the outcome feels safe. It is there because somewhere over the last few months, without a single decade of infrastructure behind her, Alex reportedly turned herself into the kind of player people simply choose to follow, city after city, match after match, whether or not anyone from home is there to greet her. And if Cincinnati really is just the preview, New York is about to find out exactly how loud this can get.